Welcome everyone online and in the classroom. I'm Jillian Chu, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Hong Kong Baptist University in the Academy of Chinese History, Religion, and Philosophy. And I'm excited to be introducing Dr. Emilie Grosvenor, and her talk today will be titled Enhanced Feminist Negotiation with Mother Teresa's Mariology, Opportunities for Renewal and Retrieval. So if you're online with us, can you please change your name, your display name into your student number and name so that it's for the CCL records, and make sure your audio is muted just so that we're keeping like noise to the minimum. And if there's anything you're unsure of, we have facilitators online. So feel free to just put it in the chat and we'll help you sort that out. A little bit about us here at the Academy of Chinese History, Religion, and Philosophy. We offer a Bachelor of Arts with honors in religion, philosophy, and ethics, and a Master of Arts, and also MPhil and PhD. And the Academy also runs a large number of general education courses. And our colleagues here are also responsible for two centers. So that's the Center for Sino-Christian Studies and the Center for Applied Ethics, which I'm also a research fellow of. And the Academy is dedicated to the promotion of teaching and research of religion, philosophy, and ethics in Hong Kong. And so our colleagues have a variety of expertise, and we also have a variety of talks that's similar to this. And so if you're interested, feel free to follow us or check out our website for more activities and details. And so a little bit about today's event. I'll leave the bulk of it to Dr. Grosvenor for her to elaborate, but today it will be about feminist theologies and how it often rejects idealizing women's suffering as redemptive, and doing so results in harm. And so she considers Mother Teresa's Mariology and think different areas about it. And so I'll keep my bit to the minimum so that she can have more time to talk about her ideas relating to this. And Dr. Grosvenor is a dear friend and an esteemed scholar, and she's currently a palliative care chaplain at the NHS Scotland and an honorary clinical lecturer at the University of Dundee. And she received her MA in the theological studies in Loyola Marymount University in California, and her PhD in divinity at the University of St. Andrews. And her interest includes an intersection of feminist theologies and bridging of academic and popular theological discussions. And this is today's rundown. And so we'll first, after my very brief introduction, I'm very much on time, which is awesome. Dr. Grosvenor will give her talk, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A, and we'll wrap up today's event. And so if you have questions and you're online, you can write it in the chat as the talk is going on, and we'll make sure we'll address your questions at the end. And if you're here in person, feel free to just hold in your conversations and the kind of questions that you may have. And we'll hand out the mic at the end so that you can ask Dr. Grosvenor other questions. And so without further ado, let me stop sharing so that Dr. Grosvenor can be sharing her slides. You're muted.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jillian. So good afternoon. Give me just one moment. Oh, hello all. Give me just one moment. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Okay. All right. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes. So you can see an enhanced feminist negotiation. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So first of all, today, just a few housekeeping things. I am at my home in Scotland. It is 4:30 in the morning. My animals are very confused as to why I am awake, so they may make an appearance. So I hope you will not think that unprofessional of me. I also have small children in the house. We're hoping that they stay asleep during this lecture. We have a lot to cover, so Dr. Chu, if you wouldn't mind, please cutting me off if I ramble on too long so that we do have time for questions, because I
I'll
really
give you a
want to
reminder for sure.
Yes, thank you so much. So, welcome to this lecture on an enhanced feminist negotiation with the Mariology of Mother Teresa and the Missionaries of Charity Sisters. The Missionaries of Charity, which are the congregation of Mother Teresa, are also known as the MCs. So you will often hear me refer to them as the MCs, as it's how they refer to themselves, and it's also for brevity's sake. So before we begin, I want to thank my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jillian Chu, for giving me the opportunity to present the fruits of my research, as well as for being a supportive colleague during the birth pangs of this project. I am further grateful to be a guest of Hong Kong Baptist Uni, and to all of you for coming here today. When I began my research, I knew Mother Teresa as a modern-day Catholic saint. My first Google search led to the surprising revelation that many have cast her as a diabolical character. Those attending today may hold such views, or be as surprised as I was, or simply want to know more about this remarkable woman and the spirituality that directed her life and ministry, and that continues to direct the Missionaries of Charity. Wherever you stand, I ask you to empty your cup of opinions and assumptions, positive or negative, and make room for some complexity today. But to also know that leaving room for complexity does not mean avoiding accountability or responsibility either, as taking responsibility for the effect of one's theology is a prerequisite to authentic steps toward renewal. So I'd like to begin today by telling you a bit about myself and how this project came to be. Originally, this project did not set out to be specific to Mother Teresa's Mariology, though I'm very happy that it did. My background, when I was still in California, I was getting my master's in theological studies, and I was particularly interested at the time in theologies of liberation and specifically feminist theologies. And I noticed that a lot of these scholars, so I'm thinking of liberation theologians like Yvonne Guevara, Maria Clara Bingamer, and even Gustavo Gutierrez, they spoke of popular religion, and yet what they were speaking of was not ringing true to my own experience of what popular religion looks like in practice by women. So their emphasis on popular religion tended to be on it being important because it shows the concerns of the people. Whereas in my own family, on a personal note, I noticed that my grandmother held intercessory prayer or prayers of petition as a primary way of relating to God, and as a Catholic of relating to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so I was curious as to why feminist theologies in particular weren't engaging with women's actual practice. And so I wanted to see what it would be like if we put a feminist methodology and the criteria of human flourishing in conversation with an actual Marian devotion. And it is then that I stumbled upon the opportunity to go to Calcutta and visit the mother house of Mother Teresa. So this is how this project started. And what I did not realize at the time was just how perfect Mother Teresa would be for the questions that I had. And I will move to this slide real quick. Oh, you can't quite see it. That's okay. So here we have a picture of Mother Teresa's feet, okay? I promise this is relevant. So why do I pull this up? Well, as a Catholic, on my way to Calcutta, I had this picture. You could probably see the mouse over it right here on my phone. Because to me, this was a very special picture. This was a picture of a woman who had worked hard all her life to bring the gospel and to bring charity to people in slums, to bring medical care. But what I ended up discovering was that Mother Teresa's feet didn't actually look like this because she went to the slums and walked all day. It was because she was purposely choosing shoes that were several sizes too small for her. Now, why would she do this? Well, Mother Teresa did this because she saw suffering as a form of prayer. And she believed that in offering this suffering to God, she could expiate the sins of sinners on earth and also offer up prayers for the sick and the dying. Now, there's part of this that is beautiful because, yes, she did she did accomplish her mission in a lot of ways for her apostolate, which was to bring Christ to people who were suffering, to satiate the thirst of Christ by providing whatever the poor in her region needed. However, she also did this through self-harm. And this is just a microcosm, and this is why I choose this picture, of how her theology had both a capacity for harm and also for human flourishing. Now, the other thing is that Mother Teresa's vision of Mary was inextricably linked with her own identity. So Mother Teresa saw herself as putting on Mary, the mother of Jesus, each day. And she assigned Mary certain virtues, which she drew from her own Catholic tradition. And these Marian virtues were used as an outline to the constitutions of her Congregation of the Missionaries of Charity. And so they are also very much part of the identity of her society today, which means that not only was Mary someone that Mother Teresa prayed to, Mary was very much part of her identity, and Mary was very much part, and continues to be very much the part of the identity of the missionaries of charity. So the difficulty here, as we will see, is that Mother Teresa didn't actually critically self-reflect on the possibility that her vision of Mary might not be who Mary is and was. I will not pretend to know exactly who Mary, the mother of Jesus, is and was, but I will introduce the possibility that she was different than Mother Teresa imagines her, and that actually Mother Teresa's vision of who Mary, the mother of Jesus, is and her virtues has consequences, both positive and negative, on her congregation, on Mother Teresa herself, and most importantly, on the people that they serve. So moving on now, So why an enhanced feminist theological engagement? So as I mentioned earlier, I first became interested in popular Marian devotion because I saw a gap in the literature regarding feminist interactions with actual practice. So in my literature review, I looked at a lot of the more famous feminist theological works by Rosemary Radford Ruther and Elizabeth Johnson. And these mostly engaged with what we might call traditional Marian symbology, with Catholic doctrine, and with scripture. Some of the more contemporary works I looked at were by Courtney Hall Lee, who imagines a womanist Mary, but who also shies away from the intercessory model. And I also looked at Alina Vuola. Oh, let me see if I can move this for you. So Alina Vuola did an ethnography of women's popular devotion to Mary across cultures. Now, she's an anthropologist, not a theologian. However, her conclusions are quite pertinent. She noticed that women often viewed their faith in profoundly different terms than their male leadership. She also confirmed that there's a lot of standpoint theory used in feminist and liberation theologies when speaking about popular devotion to Mary that doesn't quite match what popular religion looks like in practice, being the relationship with Mary as a embodied, exalted being who listens to their prayers, their concerns, both big and small. And she called this phenomenon feminist blindness. So part of this is to answer to that feminist blindness by engaging in a Mariology that might not and does not always agree with feminist epistemology. So I was also influenced by Saba Mahmood. So Saba Mahmood did a ethnography of an Islamic revival in Egypt, a group of women who were finding meaning and identity in this movement. And she argued that it's important to engage with life worlds that contradict feminist assumptions. She rejects the oppressor-oppressed model that projects Western liberal values of individual autonomy onto the majority world. And she encourages critical self-reflection by the researcher of their own assumptions, relationship, and understanding of life worlds distinct from mine. Okay. Oops. So Margaret Kamitsuka is the one who probably most influenced my methodology. So Margaret Kamitsuka writes, feminist scholars have enjoyed the privilege of determining what symbols, scriptural passages, and practices are redeeming for women. What she says is, drawing from the idea of human beings as imago Dei, we can only be identified relationally. And as we reflect a relational trinity, we are most human and most ourselves as God intended us to be when we are reflecting the relationality, equanimity, and mutuality of the Trinity. And our relational identity means we are incapable of divorcing ourselves completely from policing and disciplinary discourses. Now, these can be things such as cultural norms and taboos, but they can also be things like church doctrine. They can also be things like Marian tradition or traditional Mariology and ideas about Mary. So for Kamitsuka, negotiation is the common ground. So just as the missionaries of charity are negotiating with what she would call a policing discourse of Catholic theology, of Marian doctrine, and of their own constitutions, so too will I be negotiating with that today, albeit from a different standpoint. How and why we negotiate is what gives way to difference and diversity. And it's important for the researcher to be critical, self-critical, when it comes to how and why we do this. Now, let me move this so you can see a bit better. Okay, so there are 4 parts to this engagement and this methodology. So what I wanted to do first, out of respect for the missionaries of charity, was an attentiveness to difference. I want to know, what meaning does this practice or belief hold for the practitioner? Why is Mary important? What is it about her that's important? How is it meaningful in their apostolate, in their service to the most vulnerable? I also want to acknowledge a given theology's capacity to result in harm and human flourishing. And this is an idea that I draw from Aloysius Pieris, who's the father of Asian liberation theology. The idea that even with the best of intentions, any sort of ideology can swing either way. And it is important when we are speaking theologically to understand that we can do harm, but we can also promote human flourishing. And our intention might not be able to control which way that swings. However, I don't want to convey a relativism here. Openness to renewal must be grounded in accountability and responsibility for the outward effects of one's theology. But I also want to acknowledge human complexity that seeks to move beyond a dualistic model of oppressor and oppressed. And as Mother Teresa's life and being is very complex, that made her a really appropriate person to engage with. So, having said all this, I also want to, where are we? I also want to make sure that we have a trauma-informed approach. So when discussing Mother Teresa, we speak of traumatic events in her own life. We speak of traumatic events in the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. We speak of the traumatic events in the allegations against the missionaries of charity. There is a correlation between how trauma is integrated into Mother Teresa's experience in spirituality, particularly in her views on suffering, and this will be covered here today. I also want to recognize that a number of attendees today might have had a traumatic experience that they are reminded of as we discuss today. So, I provide this content warning that we will cover some of the harms of war, hunger, and famine, neglect or confinement in an institutional setting, and I will let you read through the rest of this list. So before we continue, I just ask that you practice self-care. So if you need to turn this off for a minute, walk away, have a cup of tea and come back, that's all right. As this is heavy stuff, okay? So to give us a bit of context, I have a bit of a timeline here on Mother Teresa's life because I don't want to assume that we all know the finer details. So Mother Teresa was born Agnes Bojakshu in 1910 in Skopje, which is in what is now Northern Macedonia. She grew up in an environment where there was political upheaval. There were people who were displaced. There was political uncertainty, and her own family were political players in this. So her father, Nicola Bojakshu, was an Albanian nationalist. And when Agnes was 9 years old, he was assassinated. Now, the way this happened is we believe he was poisoned. And Mother Teresa would have witnessed, unfortunately, him hemorrhaging out in the family's house prior to his death. So obviously this would have been a particularly traumatic event for her. She was very close with both her father and mother. Her father had also, in addition to being a politician, one might say, or at least politically active, was also a wealthy merchant. He was extremely social. He would bring back gifts from his travels to his family, and was very close with his family. So there's one, the grief of a parent and a way of life, and two, witnessing someone she loved, her parent, dying, okay? And this will come back later as to how this might have influenced her theology later on. After her father passed away, her mother, Drena, was cheated out of inheritance by Nicola's business partner, and the family was almost destitute. Drena's way of dealing with this was to become even more pious in her religious life than she had been before. She would take her children to the Madonna of Letnice on pilgrimage. She would bring her rosary everywhere with her and pray Hail Marys along the way to wherever she was going. She opened up the home to people who had been abandoned, people who were sick, people she found on the street. So obviously this also had was a model for Mother Teresa. Agnes also was part of a Jesuit church community, their local parish of the Sacred Heart. And it was here that she would learn of the devotion of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Now, the Sacred Heart of Jesus is very closely linked to another Catholic devotion of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And this would play a role in how she saw Mary, the mother of Jesus, and how she would structure the constitutions and the charism of her later order. So in 1928, Agnes joined the Sisters of Loreto in Ireland and adopted the name Teresa after Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux. And Saint Therese continues to be a very popular saint. Like Mother Teresa, she found meaning in suffering. So she might do things like not correct a fellow sister who accused her of doing something she didn't do and offer that as a prayer to God. She might engage in certain mortification practices and offer that as a prayer to God and dedicate her own self-denial and pain to unite it with that of Christ on the cross. And so Mother Teresa's theology of suffering also largely came or was drawn from Saint Therese of Lisieux. Now, in 1929, she reached Bengal. She was teaching at the Loreto School and combating poverty through education. Now, it was, generally speaking, an upper middle class school outside Darjeeling, but she did have students who came from more impoverished areas. And what she began to do is visit their families on the weekends and just be present with them, speak of the gospel with them, and bring them any necessities that they might not have, as she was quite stunned by the level of poverty that she saw. In addition, she was exposed to the poverty that existed in Bengal when she had a short medical placement at a medical station receiving victims of malaria and abandoned children. And this also had a large influence on her later ministry. During this time as well, in Mother Teresa's first 20 years in India, there was great political upheaval. There was World War II and the famine of 1941, the Raj declaring war with Japan, the Quit India movement of 1942. So the violence, famine, and thousands of displaced peoples in Calcutta led many of the Laredo sisters to leave Bengal. Mother Teresa stayed behind, and this would have a big impact on her students, who would later be some of the first missionaries of charity. In September 1946, on a train ride to Darjeeling, Mother Teresa experienced the call within a call, as she called it, and a vision of Christ on the cross, thirsting for souls. It was after this that she began writing letters to local church authorities and really feeling called to establish the missionaries of charity. So in 1949, actually, before the congregation received approval from the Holy See, she had already gathered together a group of former students, and they were the first MCs. And what they would do is they would go out to the slums. They would provide sort of an elementary education to young children. And they also began picking up people off the street who had been abandoned to die. So in 1950, they got Holy See approval for their constitutions. It was very controversial that the first MCs were her former students, as many of these young women, while they attended a Catholic school, did not come from Catholic families. Mother Teresa also had this blue and white sari that all the sisters wore and continue to wear. And that sari in itself was associated with people who cleaned the streets in Calcutta. So she was already making herself sort of impure on purpose and humbling herself in a way that seemed disgraceful for these young women. There were even threats of violence against them, and they were also venturing into areas that made it far more likely or made them far more vulnerable to murder, to rape, to assault. And so they were quite brave, and this was very risky. In 1953, Mother Teresa founded Nirmal Hriday, or the Place of the Immaculate Heart, which was connected to the Kalighat temple, and increased the level of violence and threat toward the sisters, as it was considered abhorrent that they were occupying a space that was once where pilgrims would be housed. But these threats of violence gave way to support. Something that was different about Mother Teresa was that she had a capacity for I would say tolerance, but also curiosity of religions that apart from Christianity. And so while other religious organizations would refrain from providing any sort of charity or medical care, Mother Teresa would continue to provide this whether or not someone had converted. And the fact that she provided this service for all people, anyone who was found dying or abandoned in the streets of Calcutta, and that she made sure that they had their own religious needs taken care of rather than imposing her own upon them, sort of shifted the thinking in her favor. Now, Mother Teresa grew in fame mainly to a documentary called Something Beautiful for God, which was filmed by Malcolm Muggeridge in 1969, and her subsequent winning of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. Here, wait 1 second. In her many public speeches, she was vocal in her stance against abortion and birth control, emphasizing traditional gender roles in the home. This made her an icon for conservative women in the United States, beginning in the late 1970s. However, Mother Teresa also stood against the stigma of HIV/AIDS, and she was the first to open a home for men dying from the disease in the United States. Catherine Spink notes that Mother Teresa and the MCs tended to victims of HIV/AIDS at a time when many US Christians saw the illness's prevalence in gay communities as divine retribution for morally reprehensible behavior. Mother Teresa's interpretation was reportedly the opposite. She viewed the existence of AIDS as a further call from God to open our hearts and love one another. Some of Mother Teresa's harshest critics found the basis for their arguments against her work and her stance on abortion and birth control. These critics may be considered congruent with may be considered congruent with feminist arguments that abortions will occur regardless of legality, with the knowledge that when performed illegally, they contribute to the death of women along with the babies they carry. However, feminist theologians in India, such as Evangeline Anderson Rajkumar, have affirmed that, have affirmed that the discussion of abortion and birth control in Eastern countries is set against a politics of sex that differs largely from the general context of Europe. So in the 1970s, Mother Teresa witnessed Indira Gandhi's institution of a mass sterilization program in an attempt to rid India of poverty and overpopulation. These measures were first implemented in Kerala, which then experienced a sharp decline in population, and the perceived success of the program led to the legalization of abortion in India. Indira Gandhi declared emergency rule to further curb fertility rates and began a scheme of mass sterilizations. Government officials were given quotas, resulting in the coercion of women and men to agree to sterilization. Birth control and sterilization were not framed as a choice, as in the experience of white women in Europe and the US. Instead, abortion and sterilization were experienced as something imposed on the poor to eliminate them. And it is from this context that Mother Teresa was speaking. By the mid-90s, Mother Teresa was sometimes portrayed as a masochist, or perhaps worse, someone who viewed the oppressed as passive instruments rather than independent agents. However, this criticism also arguably fails to speak to the experience of those whose suffering is not a matter of choice. Those taken in by Mother Teresa were often those rejected by family, hospitals, and government authorities. Her views on the possible meaning which can be drawn from the experience of suffering, mainly that one's pain unites them with Christ, may also be seen as having given victims of poverty, disease, and abandonment a sense of meaning and agency amid unavoidable pain. And it was for this reason that she would establish the sick and suffering co-workers for people who wanted to support Mother Teresa and the missionaries of charity, but could not go to India to volunteer or could not volunteer with the local chapter or could not financially contribute, what they would do then is do what Mother Teresa herself was doing, is use their suffering as a form of prayer. So if they had a disability, if they were in pain, if they had a life-limiting illness, any sort of anguish that they felt about this, they would use as a prayer. So over time, the sick and suffering coworkers came to include members of different faiths. And Mother Teresa changed the language of their meetings such that non-Christians could pray, "Dear Lord," rather than "Dear Jesus." So there were a lot of, there was an openness to other faiths that is often lost when we speak of Mother Teresa's legacy, that is quite important when we talk about steps toward human flourishing. She even in the 1980s spoke to Jean Vanier regarding a group of Middle Eastern women who desired to create a Muslim branch of the Missionaries of Charity. This, however, was never brought to fruition. Mother Teresa risked her life twice in 1982 to save a group of children and adults with special needs in Beirut. After praying for a ceasefire, she walked into the city's western portion where the fighting had been at its worst and rescued 37 people. 2 days later, she returned to save another 27. This is one of the few times Mother Teresa openly disobeyed church and political authorities. She said that she viewed herself as their mother, and she could not imagine leaving them, as it would mean abandoning her children. So, Mother Teresa died in 1997 on the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And her canonization process and becoming a saint in the Catholic Church actually progressed quite rapidly. However, in 2007, Brian Kalaidaczyk, then Superior General of the MC Fathers, released a compilation of Mother Teresa's private writing that revealed her now famous decades-long experience of the dark night of the soul. At times seemingly attesting to disbelief in God, the revelations in her writing shocked Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Those who were quick to accuse Mother Teresa of hypocrisy and atheism were disregarded by her Catholic admirers as misunderstanding the long line of church saints who have experienced an apophatic so-called dark night. Kalaidaczyk argues that Mother Teresa's dark night is further evidence of her holiness, as it represents her mystical union with Christ's abandonment on the cross. So deep was her love for the poor. Thus, despite the controversy surrounding the letters to her spiritual directors and accusations of masochism which pursued her in the latter years of her life, Mother Teresa's road to becoming a saint continued forward. So this is the timeline of her life. Now, how does Mother Teresa's Mariology feed into all of this? Now, when I read through her constitutions, I also used as a source Come Be My Light, which is the collection of her writings published by Brian Kalaidaczyk that I just mentioned. I do think it's important to remember that she never gave permission for these writings to be published. She would probably be mortified by it. But it does give us a more fulsome picture of who she was. And it also leads to further questions as to how her view of Mary may have even harmed herself. So in looking at these different sources, I tried to sort of systematize Mother Teresa's Mariology. So I did this by coming up with 3 characteristics that I noticed. The first is that Mother Teresa's Mariology is intergenerational and autonomous. What does this mean? So it's intergenerational in that it's something that she inherits from her mother. So as I said earlier, Drina would go to different places, accompanied by her rosary and praying her rosary. The Sisters of the Missionaries of Charity continue this practice to this day and will actually measure the distance between one place and another with how many rosaries they are able to pray. The other thing is what we call a theandric reality. So drawing from Raimundo Panikar's Worship in Secular Man, this participation in a theandric reality is participation in reality as an act of worship. And it sort of blurs the lines between sacred and profane, between now and then, such that Mother Teresa believed that she could be bathing a child in a slum outside of Calcutta and at once be Mary bathing the Christ child. Okay. So there's a quote at the bottom here. There aren't two worlds, the physical and the spiritual. There's only one, God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And this is a quote from one of the MC fathers. Okay, moving on. It's also theologal. So in liberation theologies, theologal is often used as a term to point out how praxis and spirituality are interlinked. And actually, praxis is the outworking of spirituality. So here is a quote from her constitutions. We pray the work when we live our Mass during the day. We touch Christ in the broken body of the poor. We give the plate of food to the hungry Christ, or the unwanted, the unloved he is hungry for. I'm moving a bit speedier here because I'm conscious of the time. So the third characteristic is the employment of theological imagination. So for Mother Teresa, it was important that she and the sisters were able to imagine, though also believe in a way that was very much real to them and continues to be real to them, that they are recapitulating scenes in the life of Mary each day. So when the sisters wake up, when they have Mass, and they are receiving the Eucharist, what they are doing is recapitulating the Annunciation Incarnation event. So they are bringing Christ into their body, just as Mary did at her fiat when she said yes to God's plan for her. After that, they carry Jesus out to what they name the poorest of the poor. And hopefully we get the opportunity to sort of unpack the many issues that come with that phrase. But as they see it, the poorest of the poor. And when they do so, they see themselves as reenacting Mary's going in haste to visit her cousin Elizabeth in Luke chapter 2. Then, when they are actually with the person who is either in need of medicine or food or comfort, they see themselves as satiating the thirst of Christ on the cross. Now, Mother Teresa has a unique interpretation of this passage in John, where Jesus is given the branch of hyssop. She believes that it is Mary who provides Jesus with this, because of course his mother would be the first to respond to his thirst. And so in MC chapels, and they are in over 120 countries, they have a large crucifix, and next to it says the words, "I thirst." And it is a reminder that Christ is within the people that they serve, and that just as Mary responded to Christ's needs, so too must they respond to the needs of Christ in the poor. Now, these 5 virtues, okay, and unfortunately we don't have time to go through all of them right now, are the Marian virtues that they emulate. And it is also these Marian virtues that they use, or that Mother Teresa used to organize her constitutions. And the culmination of these virtues is charity, or what Mother Teresa called love in action. And so for her, Mary was the first missionary of charity. And the way that they are able to see Christ in the poor is by their devotion to Mary's immaculate heart. They do a consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is they say a prayer where they give their heart completely over to Mary, believing that Mary is sinless. Her heart is not clouded by sin, and therefore she is able to see perfectly the will of God. And so in using her Immaculate Heart as a way of seeing, they are able to see the needs of Christ in the other in the world. Okay. Now, moving on. So having said all of this, why then the controversy? So very briefly here, some of the allegations and the allegations surrounding Mother Teresa and the missionaries of charity for the past 30 years or more have been a minimum standard of care and of safeguarding. More recently, testimonies of former missionaries of charity, Mary Johnson, Colette Livermore, and Anna Adamchikova. So Mary Johnson released a book in the noughties called An Unquenchable Thirst. And in it, she spoke about her experience as an MC, how she felt like she was very much actually part of a cult, and how she described situations of having actually some serious medical issues and being told to ignore these medical issues and offer the pain up to Jesus. She also speaks about how this exhortation to forget herself and to be silent and obedient, as Mary was silent and obedient, resulted in the sisters not always treating those they served with compassion. And so their vision of Mary then has an effect not only on the congregation, but then on those they serve. Colette Livermore gave a similar testimony in her book, Hope Endures. She also speaks about, and I should say this about Mary Johnson too, they actually speak about Mother Teresa with a lot of tenderness. And it is this complexity that is missing from a lot of the narratives that are currently in play surrounding Mother Teresa. So it's the acknowledgement that she held herself to an impossible standard. As Mary is perfect, so too did she have to be perfect. As Mary was silent, she believed Mary was silent at the foot of the cross, and did not complain, so too did she believe she had to be silent and not complain. And so despite Mother Teresa being surrounded by these women who loved her and who emulated her, she never told anyone in the 50 years of her dark night of the soul that she was struggling spiritually beyond her spiritual directors. And I wonder if she had shared this, if she wouldn't have gotten some support. Colette Livermore brings this up. And also, if other sisters who were experiencing something similar would also have related to that, and they could have worked through it as a congregation rather than suppress it. So these are some of the themes that Mary Johnson and Colette Livermore bring up. Anna Adamchikova brings up more specifically spiritual abuse and her sense that her conscience was being replaced by the words of her superior. So just as Mary obeys the will of God, so too are the sisters supposed to obey the will of a superior. And Mother Teresa speaks of cheerful, unquestioning obedience. And the issue here, of course, there's the theological issue of equating the will of a superior with the will of God. And there's also the issue of safeguarding. So we now know that we can't see ordination or status as a reason to put full trust in someone. And the development of one's own conscience is important, as is one's own discernment. And this seems to be lacking in the MC constitutions. This also has a relationship to the revelations of sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church in the early 2000s. So Mother Teresa had a spiritual director at one point named Donald McGuire, a Jesuit who would go on to be accused of sexual abuse of minors. Now, Mother Teresa read and knew the allegations against him and ended up writing a letter as a testament to his character. After Mother Teresa had done this, because she was such a significant figure in the church at this point, the investigation against him by the Jesuits sort of dwindled. And it would be another decade before he came to any sort of justice for his crimes. And this was also a decade in which he would continue to abuse children. Now, I don't want to say that Mother Teresa intentionally did this, and she would not be the first person to be fooled by an abuser. However, it is indicative of and consistent with a pattern of unquestioning adherence to authority. He was a priest, he was her spiritual director, and therefore what he is saying must be true. Now, the last thing, Mother Teresa's 50-year dark night of the soul, I just covered a little bit there. I also want to just sort of go back to this minimum standard of care and safeguarding. So there is a book called Hidden Mercy. I believe Michael O'Loughlin is the author. And it talks a bit about the Catholic response to the AIDS crisis in the United States in the 1980s. And he speaks of a member of the Catholic worker, I believe his name is Michael Harank, who was housing men who were dying of AIDS, and how Harank had seen the conditions in the houses that the Missionaries of Charities ran. And while it is true they were providing a caring space for those dying of AIDS, in the name of simplicity and poverty of spirit, they were denying people things like having a TV in their room. There was very little privacy. They refused to invest in things like air conditioning, which in a summer in California or Washington, D.C., can be considered quite the necessity. And there was a reticence to re-examine worldview and to accept critique. So in terms of opportunities for renewal and retrieval, and unfortunately we haven't gotten to everything today, what is clear is that Mother Teresa's Mariology has much to contribute to Catholic Mariology more generally. It is very much reflective of popular devotion to Mary in her willingness to trust Mary with every problem, to trust in divine providence, while also taking action herself to be the hands and feet of Christ. However, given that, it is also key to remember that other orders within the Catholic Church have had to reform after the death of their founder. So John Sweeney, who recently released a biography of Mother Teresa, speaks of how Saint Francis of Assisi, who is such a popular saint in Catholicism, actually held his brothers in his order to a nearly impossible standard of austere poverty, and not without some controversy. In the years after his death, they had to reform their way of being as an order. Now, it seems like the missionaries of charity are also at this point where they have the theology and the Mariology of their founder, Mother Teresa. They have her legacy, and they are trying to continue that forward. But at the same time, these controversies surrounding her are not going away. And so they have a choice to either dig their heels in the sand or to look at renewed ways of looking at Mother Teresa's Mariology. And my hope is that I can take some of these ideas forward in publishing some of these ideas in the future. But even as an example, seeing Mary's silence at the cross, and that being part of Mother Teresa's theological imagination, need that be because Mary is acquiescing to suffering from a trauma-informed perspective? It could also be that Mary is stunned, that she has no words in the face of such evil. And also a shift in focus to not only Christ on the cross, but the resurrection, so that the theology of suffering is not suffering for suffering's sake, but suffering for the sake of a shift into life. I realize that's all we have time for today. There's a lot I wasn't able to get to, but I am really interested in your questions. And so it might be possible that we can get to those questions, to some of these things when answering your questions.
I just saw that in your slides, the next one covers a bit about feminist theology. Did you want to elaborate a bit on that first before we head to the questions?
Yes. Okay. So what I attempted to do here then is to speak about what about Mary was important to the missionaries of charity, how they used her as a way of seeing and acknowledging this as a contribution to Mariological discourse. And this is what I hope aligns itself with this attentiveness to difference. It's also important to acknowledge the capacity for harm and human flourishing within a given theology, or in this case, Mariology. So I acknowledged that Mother Teresa, I forget what year it was by, I think it was by the mid-1980s, is estimated to have taken 40,000 people off the streets of Calcutta. She also helped to contain or suppress certain medical diseases such as redworm in the slums surrounding Calcutta. So her accomplishments are many, and her accomplishments are things that involve human flourishing. But also, there is real harm that has been done through her vision of Mary and her vision of who she needs to be, and the vision of who she believes her MCs need to be. Openness to renewal grounded in accountability and responsibility. So in order to renew or even reform, as I said at the end, there is a need to acknowledge that there has been harm. And the Jesuits have recently had to do this. They've been more open about the number of Jesuit priests who were accused of sexual abuse, of their role in residential schools in the United States and Canada. So coming to grips with the difficult parts of one's past. So this is an encouragement to the missionaries of charity today. And fourth, an acknowledgement of human complexity that seeks to move beyond dualistic model of oppressor and oppressed. So typically in feminist theologies, we might see Mother Teresa in this case as an oppressor, or the superiors in the congregation as an oppressor. And it's not that she never functioned as such, but also it's that aspects of her theology were liberative, were encouraging human flourishing. And how do we hold both of those things without one canceling out the other? So it is my hope that while I used this method to engage with Mother Teresa and MC Mariology, it is my hope that this method might be carried forward in other areas to engage and negotiate with other discourses that might at first glance seem not worthy of engagement, so that we can make more bridges.
Thank you. Let me stop sharing your screen so that I can share mine. So if any of you have questions, feel free on Zoom, feel free to type it in the chat. And if any of you have questions in the room, feel free to raise your hand and we'll pass the mic around. Let me start off with a question. And so I was wondering, like most of the time, feminist theories are quite secular and quite in opposition with religion. And there's a lot of pushback in religion for feminist theories as well. So they don't like each other. And so how do you reconcile like being a feminist theologian or investigating from like a feminist theological perspective?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think there's a few things there. I think feminism has been much maligned, and it can be, when not looked at as a critical discipline, it can be dismissed as man-hating. The feminism that the feminist sources that I was drawing from were all Christian feminists, and the way that they reconcile this, and that I reconcile this, is that their criteria is that of not only women's flourishing, but human flourishing. And so to me, this is really key and really important. And it's also part of the gospel. I understand that we need to use words to clarify and label what we mean, excuse me. But what is the gospel if not Christ bringing us to flourishing through him, right? And so what feminist theology has sought to do in the past is to uncover the ways that, due to a patriarchal, what we might call a kyriarchal structure, flourishing has been suppressed for women and marginalized groups more generally. And this is an important thing to look at, because we don't ever want to assume that we are doing everything correctly. We want to keep expanding the sheepfold. And so that's how I reconcile it, is really, to me, there is no difference between this criteria and what Christ is trying to do in the Gospels.
Thank you.
Doing in the Gospels, not trying to do. Yeah.
So questions. Oh, yep, there's a question there.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry for that. I have a question. Actually, I have a total of 2 questions. The first one is that, for me, that is quite patriarchal, especially in the Old Testament of Bible. It try to say that a female are property of a male or something like that. And do you feel like this? So this is from Bible, right? So we shouldn't be saying something like it's wrong. So how do you feel this? Is it really wrong, or we have some wrong interpretation to the Bible or something like that? And the second question is that I've heard that Mother Teresa's Mariology has been criticized, that it has too much intense devotion and on Maria. On Mary, sorry. And this may lead to some theological disbalance of the three character, the God, the Son, and Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are both great questions. So firstly, and forgive me, tell me if I miss anything in terms of these questions you've asked. So in terms of how women might be viewed as men's property in the Old Testament, or are viewed as men's property in the Old Testament, it's a great question, because yes, you're right. We go as Christians to Scripture for answers, but we can't be living in the 21st century and see women as chattel. So what do we do with this? I think one, from a feminist perspective, what someone like M. Sean Copeland might say in answer to this is that it was written by men, okay? And men are fallible, as are women. And while God is infallible, God is interpreted by human beings, and that these texts need to be read in the context in which they were written, at the time, the culture, and the events surrounding their writing give a more fulsome view. Also, and I suppose that this is my my chaplain side, part of me wants to sit in the mystery of that. Part of me thinks that easy answers aren't always helpful, and that there can be multiple feminist perspectives as to why this happens in the Old Testament. But it's important for us to be able to discern for ourselves in our own consciences and our own prayers, that women are fully human, and does the God who is love want his children created in God's image to be treated, spoken of in this way? And I suppose we might have different answers to that. But I think it's important to ask questions, like you just did, but also to just sit in the mystery of it, and also to always use human flourishing as a criteria. Now, in terms of Mary and devotion to Mary, I'm really glad you asked this, because one of the slides that I skipped over was sort of putting Mary in context in Catholicism. So there's sort of two things here. One is the official stance of the institutional Roman Catholic Church, okay? And that is that Mariology as a study is inextricably linked to Christology. And that's because Mary is Theotokos, not just Christokos. She is God-bearer. She is the mother of God. And because she is the mother of God, and we are members of the body of Christ, in Catholicism, we believe that we can claim her as our mother. And that as a human being and a member of the communion of saints, we can turn to her. And just as I can ask you to pray for me, I can ask Mary to pray for me. But Mary is in a privileged position because she is the mother of God. And in Catholicism, she's also viewed as the Immaculate Conception, meaning she was conceived without sin. Now, this is a big sticking point between Catholicism and other branches of Christianity. So it's not without its controversy. But the second part of what I want to say is the Immaculate Conception is also the most misunderstood of the Marian dogmas. It's often confused with Mary being sinless, or Mary's virginity, or Jesus' conception. And so there's an interesting relationship there, because it largely became dogma because of people's devotion to Mary as the Immaculate Conception. But then it's also the most misunderstood dogma. So are the institutional church and Catholics more generally on the same page? And the other thing is, while as a theologian, I want to say that, of course, the Trinity, God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is what I believe. Also, in practice, as there's been these very male-centric words and language around who God is, women have often turned to Mary because she knows what it's like to be a woman. And so, like my grandmother, I would say, as much as she considered herself a Christian, I think that when she prayed to Mary, she wasn't just asking Mary to pray for her. She was praying to Mary. And so whether or not we agree with that, it's a phenomenon that exists. And so I suppose do with that what you will. Oftentimes Catholics like myself will want to clear up the misunderstanding that no, we don't believe that Mary is part of the Godhead. However, in practice, yes, absolutely. People will pray to Mary. And there might be it might be seen that there's confusion there, but actually popular devotion is quite dynamic and difficult to fit into a box. I think that fully answers the question, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so I have a question.
Oh,
So I had a question as well, and I wondered what feminist theologians thought about how the institutions of the church is often pretty like patriarchal, with little like female representation in like higher spaces. In the Catholic Church, it's a big debate on the fact that like women cannot become priests, etc. And I wondered what female theologians had to say about that.
yeah. So thank you for that question. It's a good question. There's a lot of diversity actually within feminist theologies about this. So Rosemary Radford Ruthard published a book called Catholic Does Not Equal the Vatican. And so it was very much drawing a line in the sand between the structure of the Roman Catholic Church and the beliefs that she and she claims many other women held in equality between the sexes, a need for justice, a need for a more strong voice in the laity, a need for women's ordination, et cetera, et cetera. But there are also others who, while they also might be against the patriarchal structure of the church, also want to claim womanhood as its own vocation still, and sort of set it apart from what men's priestly vocation might look like. So not that women shouldn't be ordained, but that women's priestly vocation might look different. So Tina Beattie is one who talks a lot about this in her work. Yeah, so it depends. And then currently, as a result of the synod and the lack of progress that has been seen toward women's leadership in the church, many lay Catholic women have said that they're going to go on strike, so that the Catholic Church can see what happens when the women who are helping to run these parishes without any sort of acknowledgement of their ministries are not there to support the church in its everyday activities. So feminism can take, within the context of Catholicism, can take many forms. And I don't want to give the impression that it is one opinion or one way of doing things. There's a lot of diversity in there. I think that what is important to remember is that while we think of secular feminism, there are a number of women who consider themselves Catholic and feminist, and a number of theologians who write from that context and from that way of seeing their identity.
Thank you. So there's a question online. So it deviates a little bit from our focus on feminist theology to just feminism. And so this person asked that modern feminist movement has created like social instability and led to even more gender discrimination. Did you want to just sort of address this briefly within the time that we have?
Yes. So does the feminist movement, has it heightened social instability? So there's two ways of looking at this. We can say that highlighting the concerns of women and marginalized groups, either in the context of religion or in the context of our societies as a whole, that this creates instability. There's also the other way of looking at it, which is what I would stretch you all to entertain the thought of, is that actually, is it women and marginalized groups being denied rights and a voice the thing that's creating that instability? Or is it that people are speaking against that? I would say that if we're creating the conditions for people to speak up, then that is where the pressure lies, not with the women saying there's a problem, but with the people making the problem. But that's a very good question. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me
Yeah.
share my slides again. So thank you so much for being here with us. Let's give Dr. Grosvenor a round of applause. And so for those of you online, if you're interested in this sort of event, so this event is recorded, and so it will be made available on our YouTube channel later. And feel free to follow us. It's all these different ways of following. So on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And if you're interested in this sort of event and you're wanting to do more, there's actually one tomorrow. And so it's interesting because you're talking a lot about being embodied, like being within your body and living as the body being part of really important part of aspect of your faith. And this is something we have tomorrow from Professor Caroline Bassett from the University of Cambridge. And this one is an in-person event, also a CCL event. Feel free to register. There's a QR code down there. And thank you everyone for being here both in person and online. And